Before you hand over the keys with host Anne-Marie Hayes, this is episode 5, Must-Have Discussions About Alcohol and Drowsy Driving with Wytka. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Anne-Marie Hayes, and today we're talking about impaired driving. And in case you're tempted to kind of pass this because everybody knows don't drink and drive, I'm urging you to hang on because there are a bunch of issues involving impaired driving. One of them, of course, is alcohol. And if you're looking at your not teens maybe, but young adults, they are really good about getting designated drivers. They get that message using Uber. Those are all really good things. But they'll be driving with other people, and there are other issues to talk about when it comes to alcohol impaired driving, too. There's also cannabis impaired driving and other drugs. And in Canada, where we're recording from, cannabis is legal. And to a lot of young people, legal means safe. And there are a lot of other issues about that too that we'll be talking about today. And then there's also drowsy driving, which is a huge issue that is rarely talked about when it comes to young people, but even commuters and adults. So we're going to be talking about all those things. As usual, be highlighting some of the information that we need to be talking with our young people about, but also stressing some solutions that you can use to keep your teens safe. So we're going to start off talking with a guest, a friend of mine who is with us today, and that's Pete Wytka from Arrive Alive. Now, Arrive Alive is that you see in Canada all across the country. We have a lot of ads about impaired driving, about cannabis related driving. And Pete is the executive director of Arrive Alive. So welcome, Pete.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, really glad to have you. I mean, you're an excellent resource to open this conversation about impaired driving. And in Canada, we refer to it as impaired driving, which, in my opinion, is a better name than drunk driving. Because when we talk about drunk driving, you usually picture people slurring their words and wobbling back and forth and really it's very clear that they've had way too much to drink. Impaired driving is a much lower standard of drinking alcohol. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Pete.
See now, that's a tricky question. Everyone always asks, what's the magic number? How many beers can I get away with and still drive? And well, there's a reason they call it a magic number because it doesn't exist. Everybody is affected differently by alcohol and various drugs. Factors such as your weight, how often you consume, even whether or not you're on an empty stomach, can all factor into how badly impaired you will become. And so you're right, impairment is not a matter of a certain amount, it's a matter of your ability is not what it ought to be.
And you can look pretty normal and still be impaired when it comes to a very complex motor skill like driving.
Yes, that's right. And a lot of people don't realize when they've hit that point of impairment, which is why it's so important to plan ahead before you consume anything that could impair you. Because once you're impaired, you're not going to know it. And as you say, it could be subtle. It's not necessarily someone falling down drunk, and it's obvious that we've got to take the keys away from them. It could be, oh, I've had 2 beers, I'm still good to drive, and everyone says, well, he looks fine to me, and it turns out that it's not the case.
Yeah, that's right. And because it affects, alcohol affects a number of things. And one of the things that it affects is your hazard recognition. You're slower to recognize that there's a problem up ahead, or that somebody may move into your path. You're just slower and then slower to react, slower to reach for the brake, slower to process what you should do, all of those kinds of things.
You're exactly right. Impairment can have all sorts of different effects. It could be slower reaction time. It could be problems with depth perception and coordination. It could be failing to signal. It could be speeding. Not wearing a seatbelt is a pretty common thing. Basically, any mistake that you could make while driving, you're just more likely to make because, like I say, when you're impaired, you're not at 100%.
That's true. So there are two issues there. One is talking with young people about not driving when they've been drinking. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, most young people really get that. They have a designated driver, they use Uber, they're really good at that. Another issue there that impacts that is underage drinking, right? I borrowed my mom's car. I'm only 17, 18. I'm not supposed to be drinking at all. Now, in Ontario, we're not even going to talk at this point about graduated driver licensing because there are issues there as well. But just to say that happens. You didn't intend to have a beer, but you went to a party and somebody handed you a beer. And so you ended up drinking it, and now you got to drive home. And and I hear from teens all the time, I can't drive. I couldn't leave the car behind because my mom would kill me. I couldn't. I had to drive home. Those kinds of things. So, want to talk a little bit about some other choices that young people can make and ways that parents, without encouraging underage drinking, help their kids have an out if they make a mistake, so they don't get behind the wheel.
Once a young person is in that situation, and it's a tough one, especially like you say, if they're perhaps drinking underage and they've borrowed their parents' vehicle, they have plenty of safe alternatives, but they're not going to reach for them unless they've had a conversation beforehand with their parent and they feel safe to reach for them.
That is so important. I completely agree.
Right. I always tell both parents and young people, I tell the young people, well, your parents would rather get a phone call from you at 2 in the morning saying that you need a ride home or you need to be picked up or you need to stay overnight or take a cab home or whatever, rather than a knock on the door at 3 a.m. from a police officer saying that they've been in a collision or that they're in hospital or even worse. So it's always important to have that conversation beforehand and give the young people those tools that they need, and they can feel safe that if they do end up in a situation like that, they don't need to take a risky, you know, they don't need to cheat their way out of the situation. They can do the right thing. And like I say, that could be leaving the car behind and getting it in the morning, could be taking a cab home, could be staying overnight at a friend's place, could just be calling mom and dad for a ride and saying, look, I'm in this situation and I need help.
Then, when they make that call, the parents can't be, oh my God, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. They have to be, all right, I'm there. Where do you need me? No questions asked, no yelling, calm. Bring the friends home too. Make sure everybody gets home safely. Now, that doesn't mean you have to leave it there. Next morning, maybe afternoon, everybody's calm, and you can have a discussion about going forward and kind of deal with it then, but not at the 3 o'clock in the morning. They have to know they can always call you and get a safe ride home. And maybe, I mean, I had, when my daughter was younger, a couple of situations where I'd had a glass of wine or maybe two glasses of wine, and I wasn't comfortable at that point, even 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever, to go and pick her up. So leave some money somewhere for an Uber. And that's money's put aside, or a taxi or something like that. They know where it is if they need to, or maybe even, and I'm just thinking of this as we're talking, one of those prepaid credit cards that they can use for an Uber if they have to, even if the other person has been drinking and they were supposed to be the designated driver and they were at a party and your teen's ready to go home, and the person who was supposed to be the designated driver is either high and you can smell the marijuana on them, or they have been drinking and now that teen is stuck and they don't want to rat on their friend, because then maybe you'll say they can never hang out with that person again and that will ruin their life for the rest of his high school, whatever. So, I mean, you gotta, again, I mean, you can be the go-to. You don't want to get in that car. Don't let your friend get in the car either to get behind the wheel. I'll come and get you. Tomorrow we'll arrange to go and pick that car up.
Yeah, because there are enough things that can go wrong even when you do plan ahead. Like you say, that's one of the worst is, when the designated driver joins the party. But we all know that it's happened. I've been at parties where the designated driver, all of a sudden you look over and you realize, oh no, he's not driving. So that's why it's so important to have a number of plans in place that, okay, if the DD doesn't pan out, What's the public transit situation in this area? And I know this is a big problem with rural communities. And I always hear from people from small towns saying, well, it's not that easy to just get on a 24-hour bus. We don't have those out here, pal. So in that case, I'd say stay over. It's possible to still be impaired the morning after a party, especially if you're up late, you're up till 2 a.m. and you get up at 6 to go to work, go to class, get the car home, whatever the case is. Um, you can still be impaired.
That's a really important point because young people are good at doing the right thing if they're out drinking, but they don't realize how long alcohol stays in their system. And when we do our event, the Sweet Life Roadshow in high schools, we talk about 19th birthday. Everybody's buying you shots. And so there's like binge drinking. Could be. I mean, maybe not your kid, but somebody's kid is at a party on their 19th birthday where everybody's buying them shots and there's a lot of beer and there's a lot of celebration, and they go home, get a safe ride home, they're great, get up in the morning to go to work or to go to school or whatever the case may be, and they still have alcohol in their system. Kids who would never drive when they're impaired will don't think about it the next day.
For a young or novice driver, because they've got a zero tolerance condition on their license. So they can't have any drugs or alcohol in their system when they drive. So in Ontario, drivers who are age 21 or under or have a G1 or G2 license can face a license suspension and fines if they drive with any alcohol or drug in their system. So it's especially important for young people and novice drivers who don't have their full license yet, um, not to have anything, not even, we often talk about, oh, just a beer or two, and even how that can lead to impairment. But in this case, uh, it can cost you your license at a time when you're just starting to learn and you're just starting to build your nice insurance record, your spotless driving record that I'm sure we all have. Um, so it's especially, it can be a big setback for young people if you choose to have even just a drink or two and get behind the wheel.
One thing I want to highlight there is we're talking about when you have your license less than a G under 21. The drinking age in Ontario is 19. And so I've talked to other young people who think, well, once you're over 19, it's okay. And it's not. It's a restriction on the license if you have less than a full G license. Even though you're over 19, it's still under 21.
And that's another. Yeah, I think you hit on something else there as well, in terms of if it's legal, it's okay. And a lot of people have felt that way about cannabis since it's been legalized. Before recreational use was legal, it was understood cannabis is, it's a bad thing. It's illegal. And now that it's legal, oh, I guess it's safe. I guess it's fine. And sure, it's legal, but so is alcohol. You wouldn't want someone drinking a half a bottle of whiskey and getting behind the wheel. So why would you feel comfortable with somebody smoking cannabis and getting behind the wheel? And I think really it's a matter of the lack of conversation that's taken place regarding cannabis pre-legalization. I think nobody wanted to talk about it because it's illegal anyway. We can't talk about this. But it is important to talk about it because we all know it's very readily accessible. I mean, when I was a kid, there were more people in my high school smoking cannabis than drinking alcohol. Even though it was illegal, apparently it was maybe just the neighborhood, but it was easier to get their hands on.
And today, with it being legal, even if they're underage, they have older siblings, they have older friends, because cannabis smokers often don't think it's that big a deal. They also don't realize the extent to which it affects them when they're driving, because if somebody's high, they don't look drunk. They're not slurring their words. They aren't stumbling around. They don't look the same as people who have been drinking alcohol, but they're still impaired. And there's so much misinformation about cannabis, marijuana, whatever you want to call it. Part of it is that today's cannabis is much stronger than what parents and grandparents smoked if they smoked, 25, 30, 35 years ago. So you're not talking apples to apples if you knew someone who used to smoke a joint and then drive okay, or at least they believed they were okay. The other thing is that young people who would never get in the car with somebody who was alcohol impaired has no problem in a lot of cases getting in a car with someone who's been smoking because they see it as a safe choice. And they see it as a safe choice because the driver says, I'm fine. I drive better when I'm high because I'm way more focused. Is that one of the things that you're comfortable talking about? That feeling of being focused when they're high?
Yeah, you know what? I can't count the number of times I've heard that it helps me focus. And the fact is, uh, it doesn't. Cannabis negatively affects your concentration, coordination, depth perception, peripheral vision, reaction time. And I think one of the reasons why people might feel more focused is because they're suffering from that narrower view. And I mean physically speaking, because it does affect the way your eyes function. And so they really are uh, suffering from narrow vision, narrow mindedness. So
It
it
gives them
might
a kind of
appear to
tunnel
them.
vision. It's a kind of tunnel vision that where they're looking straight ahead and they're focused. They feel really focused on what's happening ahead of them. But anybody who is a driver knows you need to know where all the vehicles are around you. You need to know who's coming up on your left, who's coming up on your right, where the pedestrian. It's not just that narrow range on the road ahead of you.
You're absolutely right. Driving is a divided attention task. You need to be paying attention all the time. Like you say, the other vehicles on the road, your speed, obstacles, traffic lights, and signs. I mean, you probably have passengers distracting you. You might be listening to the radio distracting you. There's enough to deal with that the last thing you need to do is throw impairment into the mix. It's already, I know we often in Canada, especially, we sort of take driving for granted. We have sort of a very car driven society, I think. No pun intended there. Car centric society, I'll say. So we kind of lose track of the fact that this is a piece of heavy machinery and it needs to be operated carefully.
I heard somebody years ago describe cars as bombs. They're metal with filled with gasoline, and so that makes them a bomb. And in a manner of speaking, that's true, especially at high speeds. It's incredibly dangerous to be anything but sober and alert when you get into a vehicle. And teens have the least experience, although many of them have very we were talking about this the other day, very inflated confidence about their driving skills. They really do have very little experience and they haven't built up the judgment really to be able to assess what's happening. And I have to be careful here because I'm not suggesting anybody should drive impaired by anything, but they are especially at risk because of lack of experience. One of the things that I know that you and I disagree on is using devices to show the level of impairment based on how many drinks. Now, do want to qualify what I'm going to say. First of all, you can get those individual breathalyzers that people, sit in a bar and they'll use those little breathalyzers to make sure that they're under the legal limit. I do not think those are a good idea. I think that they are playing with fire because the person is clearly impaired, but they're just trying to avoid a ticket. And tickets are really there just to enforce good behavior. So I really don't like those. But there are some apps that can be downloaded from the iStore or Google Play or wherever that will help people understand how long alcohol stays in the system. And one of the things that we talk about in the Sweet Life Roadshow is a beer is a beer, perhaps, except that the alcohol level will change according to whether it's a light beer, and some of them have a lot more, like a higher concentration of alcohol. But a drink is not a drink. I like a glass of wine is not a glass of wine. What is it 4 ounces of a standard wine that constitutes a drink?
I want to say 142 milliliters, which I think would be about 4 ounces. For liquor, for 40% alcohol, it's 42.5 milliliters, which is an ounce and a half.
No, I've been to parties where nobody has ever handed me a glass of wine with 4 ounces in it. I mean, 4 ounces is pretty much nothing, in my opinion. I've had people hand me fish bowls for a glass of wine that must have 3 servings of alcohol in it. So it's not, I've heard young people say, oh, well, my dad told me a drink an hour. No, not a drink an hour. That's a really bad rule of thumb because a drink is not a drink. It's according to the alcohol content. And an hour is really not right either because it depends on your stature, it depends on whether you've eaten all the things you said before. So it's not that simple. But there are some apps, the ones that I'm talking about, that will help you understand how long it stays in your system. And as a rule of thumb, I think people need to know that. It's in our Sweet Life Roadshows when we can do them. One of the things we use is called an Intoxiclock, and we were doing a demonstration of that. And after it finished, a fellow came up and asked if our moderator facilitator could run it with his specifics. And he put in his own height, his own weight, the period of time he was drinking over, which is a thing too. If you're knocking back 3 shots in a row, it's quite different than having 3 drinks over the course of 12 hours. So the time matters too. Anyway, so this young man put all this stuff in, and he was flabbergasted with how long that alcohol stayed in his system. It can be more than 12 hours. It can be more than 20 hours before the alcohol is out of your system. And so we really need to understand that. I don't suggest using it to when you're in the bar to figure out whether you're good to drive, but I do think it's a really good tool to show you how long that alcohol stays in your system and how long you will be considered impaired if you get behind the wheel.
I always tell people if you need to, test your BAC before you drive, that's probably the only test you need. You just tested yourself and failed. You shouldn't be driving if you're not 100% certain that you're good to go. But, I have to say, you make a good point that it's one more tool for people to help understand that it's not a simple thing. It's complicated. It affects everybody differently. And in Canada, the criminal impaired driving charge, there are 3 different charges. There's impaired over 80, which is your sort of standard drunk driving charge.
Which is 80 milligrams of, sorry, 80 milligrams of alcohol in the blood. Sorry, I just want to kind of break it down a bit. So over 80. And then the next one is,
it's just impaired. And that's sort of at the officer's discretion. So you don't even need to be over the legal limit in order to be charged and perhaps found guilty of impaired driving. And I don't know if that's something we want to talk about. Do we want to get into?
oh, I do. I do, because I think a lot of people, especially I hear from American students, it's not that big a deal in that, they can get a special license. I can't remember what it's called, but that allows them to drive again. Here, impaired driving is a really big deal. And it affects you for many years, not only your insurance, which skyrockets, but affects you in a lot of different ways. And maybe talk a little bit about that, Pete.
In Ontario, we have something called the Warn range. So that's a blood alcohol concentration of between 0.05 and 0.08 milligrams in your blood.
Pete, I'm just going to butt in there because when I first heard warn range, I thought, oh, this is not a big deal. They're just going to give you a warning. That is not what warn means. So please continue with what warn means.
Right. So the first time for someone who's caught with that warn range level of alcohol in their blood will face a immediate 3-day license suspension. For a second time, 7 days. For a third time, a 30-day license suspension. They face fees and financial penalties. And you can just imagine the paperwork involved trying to get your license reinstated after something like this. Even if it is only supposed to last 3 days, it's probably going to take you longer than that to go through the process. And they'll need, for a third or subsequent, they will need an ignition interlock on their vehicle, which is very expensive and a big headache because it has to be recalibrated. So, for those that don't know, an ignition interlock device, it basically prevents you from starting your car unless you blow into a breathalyzer and register a pass, register zero on it. Um, so it's a pain in the neck. I've seen them in use. They're not fun. And also, I don't think your insurance company would be awfully impressed with license suspensions, even if it is just in the warn range. So moving beyond the warn range, drivers with zero point zero 0.08 milligrams or more in their blood, as we talked about earlier, or if they refuse to provide a sample, or if they fail a drug recognition expert's evaluation, face an immediate 90-day license suspension. Upon conviction, that'll go to a year, but immediately you'll be off the road for 90 days. Immediate 7-day vehicle impoundment, and again, think of the financial and administrative headache that is. Fees and penalties, uh, back on track alcohol education program, well, drug and alcohol education program, ignition interlock again, insurance increases, which could run into many thousands of dollars. And here's another thing, a criminal record. And imagine how that affects you for things like travel to other countries, for job applications.
A friend of mine who works for the ministry, and I won't name him because I don't want to embarrass him. I mean, not that he did anything wrong, but he was telling me about a man who called him and said, "Hey, my family's going on a cruise, and I have this DUI, or I don't think we call them that. What do we just impaired driving conviction in Canada?" And I mean, I just found out that I can't go to the United States because we're going out of Miami. What can you do about it? And the answer was nothing. That is a criminal code conviction. And a lot of countries in the United States don't want you there if you have a criminal conviction on your record. And that includes impaired driving. So, or for teens, a teen, maybe 19, we'll say, still in high school last year, maybe did the victory lap to play football. Well, the football team's playing south of the border. Guess what? When that um, what do you call them? The agents at the border agent anyway, gets on the bus and goes through, you're off the bus because you're not welcome in the United States with an impaired driving conviction. So that is huge, that component. And we don't talk about that.
It's a funny thing because you don't need to go too far back into the past. You go back to the 70s, the 60s, it's a joke. It's a punchline. It's not serious. It's not really a crime. And when you look at the way the legislation was back then, it wasn't. It was a small fee, no license suspensions, no vehicle impoundments. Sometimes you might even be told, "Okay, just drive straight home," by whoever pulled you over. But those are the old days, and in the 1980s, really, it started to turn around with community groups taking these more active stances because it became such a problem. I mean, there are probably about twice as many people being killed every year by impaired driving 40 years ago than there are today, even though the population and the number of drivers has gone up. There would have been way more collisions because it was viewed as acceptable. It wasn't really viewed as a crime. So that's why I think it's important to remind people about this.
Yeah, in my day, I mean, I remember going to parties and nobody thought twice about having a few drinks. I mean, as far as being the host of a party, the good news is that your liquor bill went way down because people will have one drink or be drinking soda or non-alcoholic punch at like a Christmas party now, rather than get in the car and risk impaired driving. But we need to make sure that our young people are getting those messages too. And you brought up another really important point, and that was the rules penalties for cannabis impaired driving or any drug impaired driving are the same. Everything that you're talking about now also applies to impaired driving by drugs.
Not to get too off topic, but I should also say that when you operate an off-road vehicle or a boat, these penalties apply for that too. So it's not a matter of, oh, don't worry. A lot of people think that, there's sort of a loophole and that, oh, the law is about drunk driving, not about stoned driving. Well, it doesn't matter how you're impaired. There's a law for it, and it doesn't matter if it's a car or a truck or a boat or an ATV or a snowmobile. Uh, all of this falls under the legislation. So I don't want anyone thinking that, there's a trick or they can get away with it.
You get an impaired driving charge, and next weekend you are going ATVing with your friends. Or you are going boating with your friends. Well, guess what? If your license has been revoked, you're not you can't do that stuff either. The license applies to everything.
It really ruins a lot of your fun and your freedom and your ability to do things. Like I say, you might not be able to travel. You might have a boss that won't hire you because you've got a criminal record, or if you were going to work, obviously, to do anything to do with vehicles, I don't think anyone's going to want to hire you to be a driver or a machine operator or whatever the case is. If you can't even be responsible with your own vehicle, then why should they trust you with a company vehicle or heavy equipment or such?
Not to mention, if your job involves those things and your license is revoked, you can't do your job. So it just affects you in so many ways. Yeah, and when we're talking about young people, if I loaned my car to my daughter and that car gets impounded, I can't get to work. So it affects everybody. And this is a really important conversation. That's why we need backup plans. That's why we have to talk to them about never getting behind the wheel if they've been drinking or smoking, and or it may not even be smoking, it could be vaping, whatever. And some prescription drugs too, they have to watch. So you always have to keep an eye on the labels on prescription drugs. But that makes me think of one more thing, and that is the exponential impairment of pairing alcohol with drugs. It's not one drink and a couple of tokes equals whatever. It's the combination makes the effect much, much worse.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And one of the problems is that because cannabis has only recently been legalized, we don't have the years and years of research that we have for alcohol. So for alcohol, we have things like you mentioned, the Intoxiclock, which isn't perfect, but can give you a pretty good idea of what the situation is. We don't have as much research when it comes to cannabis. We know that uh, being impaired by both alcohol and cannabis at the same time is it's a pretty common state among impaired drivers. So we know it's happening and we know it's bad. We don't have all the research yet, and I'm sure it will take years before we can try to figure out what exactly the effects are. But in any case, it doesn't matter because impaired is impaired. And you can write all the studies you want about how this many drinks does this, or oh, if you're what you call a poly user, if you have drugs and alcohol in your system, doesn't matter. Impaired is impaired.
That's true. And sadly, a lot of the data that we have now comes from cadavers or people who have been involved in crashes and were killed or badly injured. And so that's where we get the data from. So it will be years before we completely understand it and the levels of impairment. But we really need to start having those conversations now.
One of the things that we all realize is that we shouldn't be operating a vehicle while impaired. But it's important for passengers to also keep in mind that they shouldn't be getting into a vehicle that's being operated by someone who is impaired. And this is an especially tough call for young people because there are only so many vehicles that some friend managed to borrow their parents' car for the weekend or something. So you've got that one car, and if that one driver happens to be impaired, there's a lot of pressure to get into the passenger seat. or for younger kids who are being driven perhaps by a parent who is impaired.
Yes, it that brings up there's a TV show. I think it's called What Would You Do? And, I can't even remember the name of the guy who hosts it, but he's wonderful. But they had a situation in a high school where they, set it up beforehand. They had a bunch of teens, and the teacher was there and saying, "Okay, you guys need to go to this place, and this guy's gonna drive you." So the guy comes up, he's a little bit older, but still kind of, 18, maybe one of the seniors in the high school, and clearly he's been drinking. And he's kind of chuckling to himself, and they're all sitting there while the teacher leaves the room, comes back and says, "Okay, this is the stuff you need to take. I want you to," and they're talking to the parents saying, "Would your kids get in that car with that guy?" And eh, some parents said yes, some said no. They all got in the car. And because the teacher had told them to, it was a student in their school. Nobody else spoke up. I mean, it was just, and it could have been a complete disaster, and then, of course, they pulled them all out and had a discussion about it, and I've often thought that we should do something like that, set up something like that in a high school and see what happens. Then you get to, okay, you get in the car, maybe, everybody's been at a party, they did the right thing, they have a designated driver, and you start down the road and you realize this is not going too well. They're not making using good judgment. Maybe they're talking about the beers they were having in the other room. You didn't know they were drinking, whatever. But now you're actually in a car moving with somebody who is either impaired by alcohol or by drugs. So what do you do? And we talk about passengers speaking up. Now, you never want to grab the wheel. You never want to do anything to impact the driver themselves because that's dangerous in its own right. So, what do you do? A lot of young people are afraid to speak up because they don't want to offend their friend or they don't want to lose the ride. Next time we go to a party, this guy's going to say, "You're not coming in my car." And that matters. Their friends matter so much to them, those relationships. So, what can you do to change it? Well, you could say, "I have to pee," and maybe pull over at a McDonald's or something so you can use the facilities, and then you decide if you're gonna get back in the car or not. You could also, another one we say is, "I'm gonna barf." Nobody wants anybody throwing up in their car. I mean, it's just, especially if it's mom or dad's car or it's their own car and they're the ones responsible for no one wants that. So, that's another way to get them to pull over somewhere where you can get out of the car and decide what you wanna do. Or let's get food, and then you stop somewhere and you get out of the car and then you can decide. But that provides them with options. You never want to impact the driver. You never want to do anything to, physically affect them, but you need to be out of the car. And so those are good options, things that you can say that you can still kind of save face, but that you change the situation and get out of the vehicle.
Oh, well, that's brilliant. I'm going to say something a lot less popular, which is that, if you suspect or if you know that someone is driving impaired, whether it's a vehicle that you've just gotten out of, or a friend's just gotten into, or just some vehicle swerving on the street, you can and should dial 911 and report it because it is a crime that's happening right in front of you, just like you should call and report any other crime that occurs. Impaired driving is one too. And I know a lot of people don't feel comfortable with that, especially when it comes to a friend or a neighbor or a family member.
I'll tell you a little story, and this is a true story, um, about a situation in Florida where that happened. A fellow was drinking over a period of hours, a long time, but never drinking to get drunk. Just had a few beers on the beach, and then went to a bar at night, and he had a few beers there and everything. Anyway, he went out to his car, and the car wouldn't start, and somebody came and helped him start the car. They jumped it for him, and after he got the car started, he headed out. He ended up hitting a car with two young women in it, both of whom died. And the whole situation is unbelievably tragic. And it is a good outcome in some ways, not forever the loss for that family. But that young man who did it completely changed his life, turned his life around. That is a powerful story. But The person who jumped his car has never, ever gotten over that because um, he had an opportunity to step in, change the situation, and he let it go. He knew that that guy should not be driving. He knew that he could smell the alcohol on him, and he let him drive anyway, and it was tragic. So it's being a hero is sometimes very unpopular. And in a situation like this, it would be incredibly unpopular. But you could save a life by hiding keys, something as simple as that, um, doing something to intervene so that person who's been drinking or is high doesn't get back behind the wheel.
Once an impaired driving collision occurs, you can't take it back. It's not a nightmare that you can wake up from. It's not something you scribbled on a pad of paper and you can take out the eraser. Uh, it's done, and it's going to affect everybody involved in very, and as we've talked about, a lot of different ways. All of them serious, none of them good. So that's why it's so important. That's why we always push, a message of prevention and education and having alternate plans and understanding how dangerous and disruptive something like impaired driving can be.
It's absolutely life altering. And as you say, not only for the person who does it, but everybody else involved. And then it goes out from there to the community, the school community, the outside community. It just is the waves of people and emotion that are affected when something goes wrong. So there are lots of options, lots of opportunities to be a hero and prevent a terrible collision or a situation, a really bad situation from happening. The sad thing is that if you prevent something from happening, there's no award because you never know what would have happened. It's not until something terrible happens that you could start pointing fingers. So just never take that chance. The last impaired driving thing that I really want to talk about is drowsy driving. And this is an issue for young people. It's an issue for commuters. It's an issue for people driving long distances, and definitely an issue for teens because they're up early in the morning, especially if they have extracurricular activities. Now, we are kind of talking about non COVID. I mean, presumably at some point this is going to be over because right now there are no extracurricular activities. But there will be some normalcy there at some point. And then they're up late at night. And even if they go to bed early, it's very hard for young people to fall asleep before 11 p.m. And that's their body clock. It's just really hard to fall asleep, plus electronics, cell phones, and all that. So it's very hard for them to get enough sleep. Teens need about 9 hours of sleep. Adults need a little bit less, 7 to 8, depending on a whole bunch of different things. But we all need our sleep. And sometimes we don't get it. And sometimes we have to drive anyway. So the situation that we talk about in the Sweet Life Roadshow is two young people go to a concert. They've been at school all day. It could even be prom, leading up to prom, where you're doing so many different things. And then that's a huge long day, too. And at the end of it, you're exhausted. So what happens? You start to drive home and you are, how do you know you're too tired to drive? Well, your eyes start to water. You can't remember the last kilometer or so that you drove. Your eyes, you start to get those little micro sleeps where your eyes close for just a split second and you wake up again. And now you know you're really too tired to be driving. So, what do? The best thing when you really hit that wall and you're too tired to drive, and this comes from the National Sleep Foundation, it's pull over somewhere in a safe place, hopefully a rest stop, make sure the doors are locked and everything. Drink a caffeinated beverage followed by a 20-minute nap and set the cell phone for that. The 20 minutes is important. If you sleep longer than that, you go into another sleep cycle. and then you're drowsy. But 20 minutes is important. By the time you wake up, the caffeine will kick in and you're good to drive for about an hour longer. And I can tell you that we have a cottage up north, and a few times, especially when I was working as a driving instructor, I had really long days and where you're alert and there is no downtime, you know. So I would be driving up north after to go up north afterwards. And I knew that I was too tired to drive. So I would pull over at Buttonville Airport and pull into, they've got a big parking lot, and I'd pull in there. I'd have my caffeinated beverage, usually a Tim stop before that, and drink the coffee, have that 20-minute nap, and it is amazing how much better you feel. So talk to teens about that, and don't be afraid to use that yourself. Yes, you lose, 30 minutes or whatever, but my God, you'll make sure you get to the other end. It's it to say, well, what most teens do and what other people often do is if they feel they're that tired, they speed up to get home faster. And that is absolutely the wrong thing to do. If you must, and if it's a different sort of situation, not at the end of a workday, that there are lots of other options that we talked about for other forms of impaired driving. You could stay over. That's a really good one. You could take a nap before you go. All of those are good things. Make sure you get a lot of sleep. In fact, I heard about a tragic situation a couple of years ago where a student was driving home from university. It was at the end of the year. They had to be out of their dorm by whatever time, loaded up the car, and then got on the road to drive. And of course, fell asleep at the wheel. Um, Horrible situation and so easily preventable, but we don't talk about it. And so now if you're getting those little micro sleeps or you're hitting the rumble strips, then it's time to make sure you pull over and get that to have that caffeinated beverage. That's not when you want Coke Zero or whatever that doesn't have any caffeine. You want the caffeine, and then have your 20-minute nap, and you'll feel so much better. So, anything else that we should be talking about here? Anything you'd like to leave people with there, Pete?
I think the most important thing to take away from this all is education and prevention. Because, like I say, once it happens, it can't unhappen. And the only way you're going to prevent it from happening is by being open and honest. And it's a two-way street. You want your children and young drivers to be open and honest with you. And that's not going to happen unless you're open and honest with them. And establish some of the rules or the plans that we've talked about with your young driver beforehand, and then they'll be comfortable with doing those things and making those decisions that are the safer, more responsible choices to make.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And you made me think of a final thought too. And that is when my daughter was younger, getting to be close to the driving age, my husband and I consciously started to discuss before we went out somewhere where a party or anything like that, who was going to be the designated driver to make sure she understood that we had a designated driver too. And it's because they don't notice. They don't know that you went out and you had a couple of glasses of wine, but my husband drank Diet Coke all night. They don't notice those things unless you draw attention to them. So we'd say, and I have to admit that it was usually my husband who was the designated driver because I like to have a glass of wine when we go out. But he prefers Diet Coke anyway, not much of a drinker. So we would talk about it. So tonight we're going out to Eileen and Tim's, and who's going to be the designated driver? And my husband say, "Yeah, I'll do it tonight." So have those conversations. Make sure that they're aware of it. That you look after yourself this way too, and that their safety is the most important thing. So I really want to encourage parents to have those conversations with their young people, and then understand too that they will be in the car with other people. So share this information with your friends and your communities, because that will help keep everybody safe. Make sure all the parents of all of your teens' friends are on the same page when it comes to impaired driving. So thank you very much, Pete. I really appreciate you talking with us today. And see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Before You Hand Over the Keys was brought to you by Teens Learn to Drive. Check out our website at teenslearntodrive.com for more information, videos, and resources.